Two multicolored fish created from layers of geometric shapes swim to reveal the company name, accessibilityconsulting.ca. A school of small fish swims by, revealing the tagline, a collective of digital accessibility educators.
So welcome, my name is Jennifer Curry-Yonke. I am the Principal Educator with accessibilityconsulting.ca, a collective of digital accessibility educators, and I'm a member of the Post-Secondary Education Standards Development Committee. I'll be your host today, so thank you so much for joining us. This is our third in a series. Today we will be discussing Barrier Area 7, Physical and Architectural Barriers, of the proposed post-secondary education standards and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Today I'm excited to be joined by Julia Kowal, a disability community representative who also has a background in healthcare, Karen Csoli, Director of Health, Wellness and Accessibility at the Welland Campus, Niagara College, as well as Tina Doyle, our chair from the Post-Secondary Education Standards Committee. And today we're talking about the Physical and Architectural Barrier Subcommittee. Our chair, Ben Poyton, the AODA officer at the University of Toronto, is unfortunately unable to be with us today and sends his regrets. Julia, Karen, and Tina, thank you so much for being here today. Ben was going to do the subcommittee lead talk, but I'm wondering if, Julia, I could throw it over to you for you to give us, introduce the barrier and give us a little bit of a background on the work you all did to pull it together and present these recommendations.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. I will be very open that many of these are Ben's prepared speaking remarks. So in regards to this barrier area, our recommendations were focused on identifying and addressing barriers to accessibility in the built environment of post-secondary institutions. And we took a very broad, expansive view of what built environment actually is. So we want to make it clear, we're not just talking about buildings, we're talking about all the human-made elements of an environment where we are living, working, and studying in the post-secondary sphere, if you will. In developing our recommendations, we focused on the existing building standards that are already in use in many institutions, and we were wanting to be sure we were addressing gaps and inconsistencies across the system. So, as Jennifer mentioned previously, our recommendations were developed with a blend of lived experience and professional background in regards to barriers in the built environment. Now, all of these experiences collectively helped us to begin our work to understanding accessibility of institutions. We also wanted to note that it is now 2024, and the AODA had a goal of helping make Ontario accessible by 2025. Between when our recommendations were submitted and now, the timelines we had estimated will likely change. We don't know what that would specifically look like, and we also do not know which of our recommendations the government will accept or modify. So we can speak generally to what we had recommended. We will not be able to confirm what will be passed on a legislative level. So that's the rationale, the background as to our approach.
Yeah, so each of the barrier areas, like in the other conversations we've had, have been broken up into themes. Can you tell us a little bit about how Barrier Area 7 is, I always struggle with that, Barrier Area 7, how you organized your recommendations and what those themes are?
For sure. Thank you, Jennifer. We had 5 themes in our recommendation. Theme number 1 is around technical requirements. So these are collectively recommendations that become our definition or standard for what we want to say makes accessible. Theme number 2 is around the scope, where these recommendations are being applied, where they're not being applied. Theme number 3 was really around maintenance and upkeep, because broadly speaking, you can build many things to be accessible. However, if they're not maintained appropriately, they quickly become inaccessible. Theme number 4 was around the planning and operations, decision-making and oversight. So the idea is bringing people with lived experience into decision-making processes around the accessibility of an environment will help make sure it is accessible, and it adds a degree of accountability in the process as well. And theme number 5 is around awareness and user experience and transparency of communications and implementation at a very high level. So those are the themes at a nutshell. I'm wondering, Jennifer, whether you wanted us to go theme by theme, give it a breakdown, or whether we have people with questions about a particular area right now.
Yeah. I personally like kind of a more strategic approach. So I'm going to suggest that we do go theme by theme if there's nobody opposed to that. Because I think that in focusing on those themes, it'll help to really bring some clarity to the legislative environment that really kind of surrounds the accessibility standards and have a real proactive approach to addressing it. Karen, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Julia, for taking the lead on that here. I just want to add to what Julia's mentioned, just because thinking about all of the themes, there were a couple of there were some limitations that we had when we were creating the recommendations. And that is that there were some things that were in scope that the legislation was permitted to create recommendations for and around, and other ones that were out of scope. So if you are looking at the recommendations, you'll notice that a number of them say non-regulatory. And what that meant is that this was out of scope for what we were able to embed in the legislation. So being for post-secondary education, we could speak to what happens at institutions, but we couldn't speak to another ministry. For example, if we want to speak to the Ministry of Labor or we wanted to speak to the Ministry of Health, that was outside of our scope and our ability to add here. But what we did do was add a number of non-regulatory pieces of our suggestions, a small R recommendation, you might say, to the Ontario government about how we thought something could be achieved, an additional barrier that was outside of our ability to, as post-secondary institutions, to influence, that we thought we should highlight in there. And ensuring that there is good governance to the legislation and by the post-secondary institutions. And also trying to ensure that the recommendations, especially ones that were shared across many institutions, weren't redundant, so that each institution is doing the same work when it can be done once and then shared, or to as well as, so we focused on the financial pieces of it as well, recognizing that there are some financial limitations and making suggestions to the government about how that could be supported. So we focused on finances, we focused on accountability, we focused on transparency, as well as focusing on access for our for persons with disabilities. So just wanted to support what Julie was saying and give just a little bit of a broader scope to help you understand why the themes, why we said in the themes, what we said and what we couldn't say.
Fantastic. So let's look at theme 1, technical requirements.
Yeah, here I will say, as the name suggests, it's around technical requirements for what the accessible standard should look like. So I guess I'll preface this. Unlike other standards in other fields, we did not make our own list of what each accessible element should look like. We weren't creating new measurements for doorways or widths of hallways. We weren't doing anything like that because we found there were many such standards already existing. And what we were focusing on was rather merging multiple standards, harmonizing them to create a more robust picture of accessibility. So not just accessibility within classrooms, but other spaces as well, such as, science labs, the cafeterias, the athletic centers. So we found there were existing standards for technical specifications already in existence by different organizations. So a lot of our recommendations in theme 1 were to combine them, unify them, adopt them, and where tweaks may be needed to use a theme or rather a lens around inclusive design. So that was the theme 1 recommendations in a very, very high level nutshell.
Yeah. Karen, did you want to add anything to that, or should we throw and see if there's questions?
Yeah, I'm ready to accept questions.
Okay.
I was just going to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Tina.
I'll put in the chat. The University of Toronto has updated their facility accessibility design standard. And based on it, we pulled also from the AODA recommendations and from the other standards. So I'll put it in just because it's something updated. And I know people are looking for technical standards. There's some things in our design standards you won't find elsewhere. So there's a few things we created design for where to put door openers and some design of the washrooms where there's more consideration for scooters and the size of scooters and whatnot. So there's, I'll put it in the chat, but if you can't access the chat, you just need to Google University of Toronto Facility Accessibility Design Standard. But it was helpful looking at the AODA and recommendations and thinking about the needs of our community as we were designing this.
That's great. I think that adds to, because in the standards, there was already the OCAD-U Facility Accessibility Design Standards, but that was from 2017, as well as the checklist for making science labs accessible for students with disabilities from 2014. So having something more updated is I think, a great way for us to move forward. Are there any questions? Yeah, Kate.
But maybe a contribution if that's useful.
Absolutely.
We're so close to publishing our barrier-free design standard at MAC that is, I think, a very updated version of what we might have been seeing from the linked documents that are very helpfully included in this section. So if that's useful for folks to know, I'm sure that those will be broadly published and circulated, and it has taken us many years to get to this point of publishing this thing.
Do you know when they could expect that possibly?
I think before the end of the year, and it's mainly been Anne, like our wonderful Anne Pottier, who's been a huge champion of it. So, and we worked really closely with Access Level. There's a disability-run organization out of Alberta, who it's disability owned, and they came in and kind of helped us with a lot of the structuring of the development of the standard and the public consultation process. So that was very helpful, and I'm sure that Anne and George, our facilities folks, would be really happy to engage and share that work with the whole sector.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. If there's no further questions or comments, we'll move on to theme 2. So looking at the scope, what do the standards cover?
Thank you, Jennifer. So as Karen mentioned, the scope of what we were allowed to be making recommendations for and where we couldn't was a constraint in our development process. However, we also wanted to recognize that education and schooling happens in so many types of spaces in the post-secondary education sector, and that these spaces may not all be owned or operated by the post-secondary institution itself. And all of these spaces deserve to be accessible for the students and teachers who are trying to access it. So a number of the recommendations in theme 2 were attempting to address the fact that many spaces need to be made accessible, and there may be different ways of doing so. So for example, one of the recommendations was around how these accessible standards can be upheld in third-party controlled spaces, or where services are provided on campus versus off campus, or around experiential learning. So even though a university or college cannot physically make each student placement host site accessible, there are things that a university can do to help make sure that those spaces are as accessible as possible, or available to students with disabilities who may need those particular supports. So that's a lot of what is within the scope recommendations.
And I think that, I think here is where you have quite a few number of non-regulatory standards, because there's such limitations in making recommendations on placements and work opportunities and internships and experiential learning. Was there anything that kind of came out of this that you'd like to emphasize that you hope other organizations follow?
I would say the one or two takeaways that a university or college could do now is thinking about it as a duty to inquire or a duty to prioritize. So it's not about an institution trying to spread itself too thin and fix where students are going on placement, or where you might be renting facilities. There are some things you can add, and by you, I mean a university or college. There are things that an institution can add into their procedures, their processes, their memorandums of understanding, the contracting that they do, in order to access spaces that are more accessible, that are upholding these standards, versus using spaces that aren't as accessible. I think that would be the big takeaway. It's more a procedural piece.
Sounds like an education piece to those organizations that you're working with as well. Karen or Tina, did you want to add anything in here? No, I think the scope is pretty clear. Okay, so let's, any questions from anybody or any comments before we move on to theme 3? Yeah, Kate.
I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm always this person who's just like,
honestly, I'm very grateful for it. So.
Okay, because this section I think is the most exciting section of the whole barrier area, but also the most confounding in some ways from what you described, Julia, sort of this idea of it being more procedurally focused. I think the framing of duty to inquire is extremely helpful. It kind of takes it into this area that links it to the OHRC. So I think that that's extremely helpful. I wondered, we've got varying degrees of competency within our own organization in this particular area. I mean, I can call out our School of Social Work as being very good and attentive to this particular practice. And I suppose I wonder if there was any consideration or thinking from the group around a little bit more around the how, because this has been placed in the physical architectural barrier section, which is largely going to be mapped to our facilities folks and our procurement folks. Like they already kind of have their eyes on it. But these 3 or 4 areas are very explicitly overlapping with experiential education, which is just completely separate from our facilities folks. And even more so tends to be embedded in the program, right? Like it's a practice that's facilitated through the program. And the relationships with those educational providers can sometimes be a little precarious, depending on, to be blunt, the sector's need for labor tends to be where there's sometimes a breakdown in communication if we're inquiring or if we're doing sort of like our due diligence, and then folks are like, oh, this is too challenging. We're going to kind of exit out of that relationship. So I suppose I wondered if there'd been any thought about, programs or disciplines that do this particularly well, like the idea of kind of collaboratively sharing information across experiential education sectors, or a recognition that experiential ed tends to be not great at intersecting with accessibility in its entire field, right? Like there's a field of placement coordinators, for example, who could be very targeted through these types of recommendations. I know it wasn't your job to define the how. I know you folks are defining the what, but I just wonder if there was any talk about that among the group.
If I may take a stab at part of the question, and then I may turn it over to Karen, I would say 2 points in regards to your very excellent question, Kate. Many of these themes and recommendations in Section 2 and some of the other ones where there's a procedural element, I think would be well served or complemented by a couple of the recommendations in an upcoming section around embedding people with lived experience in, oversight committees, planning committees, in the operation committees, beyond the facility sphere, if you will. Because when you're quite right that, people in certain offices don't always have the same level of expertise as, people in social work or the disability community, or people whose job it is to care about these elements. So because there are these varying levels of education, bringing people with firsthand lived experience into the process can help complement this. So that would be point 1. Second point, which is, I think, going to be a little bit of a segue around experiential education. There are other places, other partners and organizations where post-secondary educations could perhaps learn from or model processes from. So now, speaking from my professional background, my organization has a number of employment programs that are intended to help youth and young adults with disabilities find jobs. So they have similar issues of finding appropriate placement sites as colleges and universities. However, they have found certain avenues of success. They have toolkits, they have resources, they have the checklists, they have people dedicated to supporting this. And I would imagine that colleges and universities may be interested in having this level of expertise when it comes to matching for placements and things of that nature. So there's nothing stopping someone in post-secondary education from asking someone outside of the education field for what works for them, processes, ideas, and supports. And then I'll turn it over to Karen, who has a lot more insight on the placement pieces.
Yep, just unmuting. Yeah, thanks, Julian. And thank you for that question, Kate. I think it's an important one in this section. And I think the first point I want to highlight is what we tried to do in this, in focusing on this barrier area, is recognize that it is not just the physical and architectural barriers that exist are not just a facilities management issue. That it does overlap with different parts of a post-secondary institution. So that's why we've included that part here, is No, it isn't just for that area, but this is where it overlaps with some of the other aspects of the institution and the academic areas. Now, when we were thinking about good governance, how does governance come into supporting these recommendations? Recommendation 132, which is the second one under this theme, I think speaks to your question about how do we come up with these guidelines? How are we ensuring that we're using the same oh my gosh, I can't find the word, using the same standards for, let's say, nursing as we are for early childhood education, and for the same at a college and same at a university. So that this is where we're thinking there's to avoid redundancy and everyone doing the same thing and then coming up with 100 different checklists. That we would ask the government to be working with Colleges Ontario and with the Council of Ontario Universities. And they could then be, so we didn't get as granular as you're thinking. And I appreciate that, because so thinking about talking to placement coordinators, talking to placement sites, that this is something that could be created under the leadership of the Ministry of Colleges and Universities, using our different organizations and doing that work for us, and then sharing that with us so we can be using it in our academic areas.
Yeah, it's extremely helpful, mainly because, to your point, Julia, in the absence of these standards, we have people who you're describing, Julia, who are embedded within our organization, people who are really, really good at understanding how to source accessible placements, but they sit in our Student Success Center. So they're now getting sort of rooted all of these sort of handoffs, students who are difficult to place from academic programs. There's been no integration of the knowledge into the academic program. They get then sent over to our SSC. They facilitate the placement, taking them out of the academic placement site process in the meantime, and not really, it's too concentrated in one area that's outside of our academic responsibility. So I think the idea of kind of framing this as an academic responsibility is, it's the thing. And yeah, the use of space being attended to in this particular recommendation. Thanks for the clarification.
I wanted to add, Kate, to respond to you, because we have co-op on my campus. And I've been presenting to our experiential steering working group these recommendations. And
what are their thoughts?
Well, it sits in the academic area. And so we've never brought it into accessibility, that this is our responsibility, that we work in partnership. We always have worked actually really well with our co-op departments. So it's about education and making sure that we're clear on everybody's responsibilities. And so I think that's, sometimes it's the structure, and it's education so that people can understand whose responsibility really is this. Yeah. And so if we don't want to take students out of the system. So in our system, the placements are the responsibility of co-op. They have co-op coordinators who specialize in this.
Yep.
And if they need to bring us in, they'll bring us in to support them. And the more they do it, the more they think about it, the less they need us. Which is what you want the outcome to be.
That's the trick. Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of having conversations in terms of what are the needs and who's best to do it and who can be a support, and we're the support. Because I don't know placements. That's not our expertise in matching. That's
the problem. Well,
and all of that.
And facilitating accommodations on placement is wild. It's very difficult to do in a controlled way. So
yeah, and we can can we make recommendations? Sure. A recommendation was simply, one of them was making sure that the job posting is very clear about the core requirements of the job, so that they know, can I do this? Can I, if they're requesting, saying you have to lift and do certain things, for example, then the student can make an informed decision whether or not that's a placement for them. So I think that's just something as simple as that. When we have run into an issue with maybe an employer, that's where we've said, hey, like, what are the essential requirements, and how does the student know that? And how does the person matching them know this about your space as well, which it ties into the physical space overall. So
always comes back to those essential requirements.
Yeah.
Yeah. For us, it's clinical. It's the clinical placements are killer.
Yeah.
I digress.
But we can't control their space and we can't control their accommodations, but they need to know what their responsibility is. And that if somebody can't get in the door, then what's their responsibility in Ontario, not just for post-secondary students.
Yeah, and that's the value of having those non-regulatory recommendations.
They, in many ways, as I've been analyzing these, I'm like, the non-regulatory recommendations hold almost all of the framing value. Like, they really frame all of the recommendations that come after them. So yeah, I hear you, Jennifer.
All right, so let's, first, anybody else have anything they'd like to add or any questions? Okay, so let's move on to theme 3, maintenance and upkeep, because I think this area is so vitally important to the built environment that hasn't been previously discussed.
Well said, Jennifer. Well said. What's the point in having accessible equipment if it's not maintained? So our recommendation in this, the recommendations under this theme were very much intended to make sure that all the features of the built environment that are intended to promote accessibility, that they're in good condition and maintained, including through weather and all sorts of events. So this is why our recommendations are around things like knowing what these essential elements are for an institution, figuring out when do they need to be maintained, how much does it cost to maintain them, what are the key parts that are always breaking and needing to be replaced, and then how do you protect the money? How do you make sure you have a timely schedule for maintaining this? And I'll be honest, a lot of these recommendations were sort of based off of our anecdotal experience of things like, oh, that elevator broke, and then it takes 2.5 months before a technician looks at it and before a part comes in. So we were able to sort of backtrace all of the problems in routine maintenance and upkeep, going, okay, things are delayed because of, people not knowing that it's required, people not knowing the timelines. So this was a very important element to the standards, because in many cases you can prescribe a space to be accessible, but it's not just about building it. You have to keep it in good condition.
And Karen, would you like to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, well said, Julia. I'm going to say we also started to get into in this theme, touching on some of the financial responsibilities and understanding and trying to understand that this sorry, I lost my train of thought right there. Something
That's
outside
okay.
my window just took my thought away. But we started looking at financial structures and what knowledge we have about finances for the built environment. This is where we start to come in. And we're looking at accountability for those finances as well. So like recommendation 138, we're saying track and report the spending on maintenance and upkeep. We have really no knowledge of how institutions are supporting accessibility. so it's hard to say what is also then needed in addition to what they're doing, especially when we're going back to the ministry to say, this area needs more funding or this area needs more support, because we're not tracking any of the numbers. So we're looking at that. Starting to look at procurement here as well, and ensuring that accessibility is part of our procurement processes, and keeping metrics as well.
Yep. I think that a big part of this area is understanding their, it's kind of more probably in IT, but it's understanding their accessibility debt or their legacy debt. Does make, keeping something that is out of date and trying to maintain it, does that cause them more debt than, more upfront in replacement, but longer term benefits in the accessibility field? So really understanding, I think, and having those metrics is so important to being able to quantify and plan for the long-term benefits. Yeah, Tina, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to something that Julia said. And it ties into another recommendation, so I'll put in the chat. Facilities management, design, construction staff need training. That's in another section. And so I'll put it in the chat, that recommendation, because I think that's the important piece when you talk about maintenance, for example, is they need to know, for snow, for example, because we did talk about a weather event, is the staff need to understand why it matters, and I'll give you an example. We had a huge storm. I went around taking photographs of some of the things that were done with the snow and where it was piled and where it impacted movement. And then we brought it to all the maintenance staff, and they use that for training so that they could see it and with an explanation of why that actually was impactful. And then it helps them prioritize that, it helps, it has to align also with the values of the institution. With maintenance, if we say, the doors openers, we can't wait, 6 months to then first look at it. People with disabilities need to get in the door. So, and they should have independence. So it's about also the facilities prioritizing and recognizing the priorities of the institution align often with the AODA recommendations.
Anybody have any questions for around this barrier area? This theme? All right, let's go on to theme 4 then, because I think it really flows in very nicely about planning, operations, decision-making, and oversight.
Yes, theme number 4 is very much the glue, the accountability glue that holds some of the other recommendations together. It's what makes it possible. So a number of the recommendations here, some of them were around bringing in lived experience into the process of renovations and redesigns, making sure things aren't built with more barriers unaddressed. So those are some ways of prevention. We were also acknowledging that some buildings or spaces cannot be made fully barrier-free for a variety of legal or geographic or technical reasons. So what do you do about that? Well, we want to make sure that there are equally effective alternative access means for those spaces. We've also had a number of recommendations in here around developing an accessibility consultation committee or having training for staff. And the idea around this is to make sure that accessibility becomes something or of a responsibility for everyone. Everyone has a role to play in making sure a space is accessible. So we want to make sure everyone's equipped with the knowledge, the skills, the ability to carry this out in their work. And There's also some procedural stipulations around things like when you're procuring contractors and vendors, making sure you're explicitly mentioning compliance with the standards. There are a few non-regulatory suggestions in here around financial incentives for the organizations to make sure that compliance with the standards is upheld. So again, very high level description. I'm happy to answer questions about this or have Karen or Tina jump in case there's anything else they wanted to add.
This probably had the most recommendations, this section, so. Any questions or further comments? Anything you'd like to be more informed on?
Can I ask if we have chatted about the role of the consultation committee at all? I think it's in this section. I think.
Excellent
Yeah,
question.
I
Yes.
think it's recommendation 148.
Yes.
It's good memory.
No,
It's
I
like-
have it in front of me.
I was going to say, it's like you helped build it. I suppose I'm wondering because, you know, we've currently got several committees that if we combined them would make up the makeup of the consultation committee that's been recommended in number 17. And that committee meets monthly because it's an incredible amount of work sort of that they're trying to move forward and might transition into more of a consultation committee as opposed to actively trying to bring together a barrier-free standard. And I think I noted in that recommendation that that committee would meet 3 times a year. Is that correct? Just sort of wondering if there was sort of like how high level that consultation committee was envisioned as being, because it looks like they're being tasked with several areas of consultation. And so just sort of wondering if folks had considered how that might take place, because I think there would probably be hundreds of projects that folks would be consulting on in different areas depending on the configuration of the meeting agenda, because it looks like they're being asked to consult in this area, but I think they're being asked to consult throughout other areas of the recommendations as well. And if this had also maybe been conceived of as sort of a subcommittee, like something that would specifically focus on the built environment that maybe sits as part of the broadly envisioned committee under recommendation 17.
Yep, it is, and it's only meeting twice a year.
Twice a year. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent question. I will be fully transparent and say I don't have the written wording for recommendation 17 in front of me. However, if memory serves, there were a few other barrier areas that also wanted or thought a consultation committee of some sort would be beneficial to their recommendations. So similarly, our group thought a consultation committee would be very helpful as well. The case of the built environment can be very technical, can also be a lot of project work. So the implementation of a consultation committee may look a bit different from institution to institution. So we wanted to write the recommendation in a way where there's a bit of flexibility. So for example, a smaller college with one campus may have just the one committee, and they may meet in a time frame that more closely reflects what's written in the recommendations. However, some larger institutions with multiple campuses, with multiple departments, it may not make sense for them to do it all as one. So it may be that they make a separate committee or a subcommittee. They may have one for each campus. They may build it into their facility management department. So I think while the letter of the recommendation is referring to one committee, it would be my opinion that the spirit of the recommendation is making sure you have adequate and sufficient representation of lived experience for each of the areas and fields you're working in. So if you have a very large built environment you're having to oversee, you may need a sufficiently robust committee structure of some kind to address that. So the frequent things, where that sits, how many people, I think that would have to be scaled on an institution by institution basis.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think this is the that gray area that sits between the people who've developed something infused with spirit and then the translation of the recommendations into regulation, which then, I mean, even now with the current regulations under the AODA, people lose their minds if they feel like they don't exactly understand how to implement the regulation. If it's not being, because you've got compliance officers that are typically dealing with the regulatory requirements, not people who might consider what you've just described, Julia, sort of an interpretation that meets the spirit and like the need of the organization. So I don't know, I think that'll probably have to be the accompanying education piece. It's just sort of, look through the letter to kind of understand the need in the context.
Sure. And these, again, are just our recommendations.
Absolutely.
There's a few levels of interpretation and drafting before it gets legislated. So it may turn out to be something that's chiseled down more specifically into digestible pieces. It may just be written in a way where it's flexible.
Like have a committee.
Yes.
Yeah,
for sure. I think the key part of recommendation 148 in our section is that the input of the committee is actually tied in with the departmental reporting structures. So it's very much not just a committee that rubber stamps things after the fact. It's very much one that has dialogue and reflection with the departments that have to oversee the built environment. I think that would be the bigger part of this recommendation specifically.
Super helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's move on to our final theme: awareness, user experience, and transparency.
Right. Theme number 5 is a very big theme. I did count. There are more recommendations in here than the others. And that's because there's a lot of responsibility for the built environment, and not all of it's on the post-secondary education institution, because that's not feasible. So a lot of these recommendations here, a number of them are non-regulatory because we're trying to reflect the different actors and agents who play a role in either the design, the building, or the upkeep of the built environment. So for example, there's a number of recommendations here around training and certification for working professionals such as architects or landscape designers in regards to accessibility for the built environment. So that, again, was strictly out of the scope of our committee. However, we felt it's important, an important element, because if people aren't trained to design things accessibly, if it's not a licensing requirement, then there's a risk that things are going to keep being built in an inaccessible manner. So we're just trying to build the most robust supportive system possible. We also have a few recommendations around maintaining accessibility when there are temporary barriers, particularly for things like construction. So a number of the recommendations are acknowledging that construction happens, there are temporary barriers to accessibility, and yet that should not be an excuse for not trying to make sure the space can be as accessible as possible in those constraints. So we have things like saying, make the disruptions as short as possible, having alternate accessible routes identified, having clear communication of this. There's a big element around accessibility with wayfinding and signage, things of that nature. Some other recommendations in this area are around the notion of reviewing the accessibility of the built environment in an ongoing manner. Things evolve. people's needs change over time. How you use the space may change over time. So assuming a building has been built to be accessible once does not mean it will stay accessible depending how you're using it. So we wanted to make sure people are continually looking at the space, identifying its use, working to improve it. And then there were a few recommendations in support of that around continually working to make the space accessible, keep doing accessibility improvement projects and things of that nature. I'll also mention we had one recommendation around promoting compliance around the building code as well, because we did note there were a lot of gaps and confusions in regard to the Ontario Building Code and how it aligns with the AODA standards.
Thank you, Julia. Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, so if I can just add, one of the questions we've been getting, and I know are being asked at your institutions, is as we're waiting for the government to finalize the recommendations and bring them into law, what can we do at our own institutions? And there are some in this section, some very obvious ones that if you don't have notice of temporary accessibility barriers, accessibility during construction, these are things that can be done fairly without the legislation being put in place. They're pretty straightforward. I also want to say that the another piece in here that I think is pretty important is really, again, bringing things back to procurement. So when there is a new design, when there is a new build, and you want it to be accessible, how are you in your procurement process? How are you asking your designer, your architect, about accessibility? Do you know what questions to ask? Are you getting information about their training, their background, their knowledge base, their experience, as much as you're getting the answers to other questions related to their background experience and knowledge? So that's something else that we were trying to flesh out here as well, that it becomes equal to, not an add-on or an afterthought to that procurement process of when there's a new build or a renovation.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Julian, Karen, and Tina, thank you. You've done a fantastic job kind of putting you on the spot at the last minute here to take on the lead. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate you guys being here. If there are any questions, we'd recommend that you kind of take a look at the standards in a little bit more detail. You're also welcome to reach out and join our mailing list if you'd like to follow up on upcoming workshops as we dive deeper into some of the other standards. And if you'd like to receive a copy of this presentation. Thank you to our interpreters, Sharon and Ro. Appreciate your time. And as always, Tina, thank you for popping in and giving us your insight.
Quote, "Give them a fish, feed them for a day. Teach them to fish, feed them for a lifetime." A small green fish swims by, leaving a trail of bubbles. At accessibilityconsulting.ca, we believe in teaching you to fish. The small green fish swims diagonally downward from right to left. Two multicolored fish created from layers of geometric shapes swim to reveal the company name, accessibilityconsulting.ca. A school of small fish swims by, revealing the tagline, "A collective of digital accessibility educators." Design, Aya Noishi. Animation, amphibious animation. Website, CMS Web Solutions. Description, Lakeshore Media Services. accessibilityconsulting.ca. Contact, info@accessibilityconsulting.ca. The small green fish swims by, leaving a trail of bubbles.